As we've come to know, live-action remakes are the bane of any true animation fan's experience. They take something that was more tangible in that particular art form and end up mocking it like it was just some sort of genre instead, making films that never needed to be made except for financial gain off of nostalgic memories of the past. But the more interesting and probably the worst part of it all is the potential of such films getting sequels, an area Disney clearly to this day has no real grasp on making actual quality films out of it, which is also the case of any of the content surrounding all of their live-action remakes as the subject of this video, one where we should talk about why they don't work as well as anyone would think, or anyone else for that matter, of its opportunity. Ideas on paper that could potentially work, but end up not because nobody even cares. Because besides just being sequels to the remakes themselves, they are overall original film stories based upon the characters of the reimagined films containing something with a different path that is mostly, or not even based at all, on their original direct-to-DVD sequels. Of course, we are talking about something like this after a film like Mufasa, a prequel that also should be discussed in this category since it does have sequel elements taking place after the events of the original, and most films, either prequel or sequel, still take events from their predecessors so it fits the billing. But we are not going to actually talk about Mufasa that much in this film since it already came out, and we should focus on the other content that has. But like we just said, the reason we should discuss these small portions of film today is because of how they generally fail to impress compared to their predecessors, how the obvious answer is laid bare upon people that are not interested in the sequels to the films they watch because they are just remakes and they want to see that, and just do not do a good enough job of proving why they should even be a franchise, but how Disney themselves is persistent on this based upon the idea's potential but not the medium they are doing it in, thinking that live action presents an easy answer to the other ills that plague them from time to time, even if that genre is still super small, only comprising of 4 movies released so far under the live action banner, which is funnily enough the same amount of films that Walt Disney Animation has officially released theatrically currently, until Zootopia 2 comes out to take over. I just also want to note that this video is going to pertain to films only released with sequel content, discounting others like Cruella on the basis of being a standalone prequel to the villain character and not on future events like other films like Mufasa did that was both prequel and part sequel. But to start things off, we find ourselves going way back within the first theatrical remake being 101 Dalmatians starring Glenn Close as Cruella de Vil, who reprised her role in the first remake sequel being 102 Dalmatians. And the funny thing to talk about this is the fact that this was the first real sequel to the Dalmatians franchise, with the original film animated version not even getting its direct-to-DVD release until 2003, 3 years after this film came out, where they just called it 101 Dalmatians 2, Patch's London Adventure, if you really wanted to know what kind of film that was going to be. But the biggest difference you'll see here between this and most of the other sequels that came after this is that Cruella is the only major character that returns. Not the darlings, not Perdita or Pongo or the original puppies for the most part, but just Cruella herself and our butler, who takes over Jasper and Horace's role, who just apparently stay in prison from the last film. In that regard, it's not really a 101 Dalmatians sequel in the sense that the main heroes are back, but still is when the main villain is still there, the only big memorable or remotely good part in any of those films anyway. And despite the newer characters, it just ends up being more of the same story, with her reverting back to Cruella after appearing to be cured of her fur coat desire. So you have these other characters like Chloe and Kevin working together to stop Cruella to raise these puppies again. Just basically very similar to the first film when they have this similar plot in terms of what they have and what she wants, getting to the same happy ending with her own defeat. It was just not a good movie regardless, where most people felt that way, and it became the first box office disappointment in the process. Not a bomb like later would show, but certainly not successful either. And in terms of the movie's flow, at times it does feel like it drags on, and then the pace gets ramped up to that early 2000s Disney wackiness that had to exist in their live action movies, where the villains get ragged on by a bunch of animals or kids or other intense situations that only this era could have provided. The only interesting thing about this is the continuation of Glenn Close as Cruella, and the fact that the animals watch a Disney movie. In fact, the movie they watch is Lady and the Tramp, that apparently in this world, the original animated film exists in this live action universe, where I think this has the distinction of being the only live action remake based film that has a reference to another original animated film that Disney has done, if that's a weird fun fact you wanted to know. Speaking of Lady and the Tramp, they would too get their own remake in the future, being the first Disney Plus original, but interesting to know what kind of films they were doing at the time. Clearly different from what we know now in the fact that they are just realistic versions and nothing more. I mean, watching this again, I think I prefer Cruella over this. That's actually a better movie regardless, despite not being the Cruella you think or know or the certain situations that pertain to her becoming who you think she is. We should also mention Cruella in that fact because this film also started to use CGI dogs more often. Not actually like Cruella would do later to the extent it was, but for the wacky sliding scenes that the puppies couldn't do, since it would still just use real animals for the most part of the scenes until they started to do something like this. And as the final results showed, they did put the lid on any future remakes or other films for a while, being the last one until they did Alice in Wonderland. But before we talk about Alice in this sense, I would also like to mention after Cruella was released, Glenn Close also pitched a sequel to the films again in 2021, with her playing the character once again in a setting like New York this time. And where that would go, who actually knows with the future of this genre still on the wobbly wonky path that it is. Where Alice in Wonderland did take that to a really extreme degree with Tim Burton's 2010 film that spurred off the live action era we all clearly love today. But back then, Alice wasn't really regarded as a remake and more of a reimagining of the world based upon Lewis Carroll's original work and how the world is designed so differently to Tim Burton's style, and Alice being clearly aged up compared to the original animated film. It's one of those movies that is more visually interesting rather than narratively appealing, taking elements from both of Carroll's books, where clearly with just those attributes it worked to some degree, making $1 billion, thus jump-starting other movies in the works and greenlighting the Alice sequel as an obvious result. Except this time without Tim Burton really involved as a director and just producing. It was the first major theatrical release to a Disney film since of course 102 Dalmatians 16 years earlier, before Ralph Breaks the Internet would come out 2 years later, focusing again on Alice's adventures back to Wonderland after dealing with the fact that she would sign her father's ship to her ex-fiancé for the house because he inherits the company that his father runs, thus making him her boss, and they don't have time to fix that part of their life before signing it over. The main plot of this movie deals with time when she goes back to the Underland in this film, where most of the characters are concerned about the Mad Hatter acting madder than usual about his own family. So she goes on this adventure to consult with Time about bringing his family back to help him get better again, and then ends up stealing the chronosphere to alter past events to find his own family. And then later in the film she gets involved with the backstory of the White and the Red Queen and events that caused them to be where they are today, trying to change that but then drastically making the present day worse under Time, where it turns out the Mad Hatter's family got captured by the Red Knights during the Jabberwocky attack, and how the Hatter becomes gravely ill until she says she believes him about what she's witnessed and then revives him all of a sudden, getting to see his family again who were shrunk down, and then getting seized by the Red Queen who wanted to go back in time, with her sister lying about stealing the tart that caused the paradox because she was mad about the lies, seeing her younger self rusting everyone as a result until the last minute when Alice puts everything back and makes this entire point probably mute. Again, redeeming everyone and having Alice learn a new lesson about time and moving towards the future, where the ship is just one opportunity where they don't sign it to keep the house and move on with their life to start a new company, with nobody else telling what you can or cannot do. And where the end overall message does have something good in telling, everything else about the movie just simply goes nowhere despite continuing the wacky visuals that were the highlight of these films to begin with. Just speaking about the basic plot premise just seems very confusing, and watching it doesn't help either with a narrative that just doesn't go nowhere in particular like Mr. Toad. Just like the original film, other than some of the big messages, they aren't really anything like the books themselves, going off in a different direction on this action-adventure type story rather than straight madness that was just basically a little girl's imagination. It tries to be clever at times and tries to be something of a plot, but ends up being forgettable when you hardly care about the character's journey or what they particularly believe in. And the audience hardly believed that too, continuing the same trend by 102 Dalmatians being a box office letdown, where in this case, it wasn't just a disappointment, it was just a straight up box office bomb, losing about $70 million for Disney. Compared to its massive original $1 billion success, this was just a straight dud other than the Pink song that at least hit the charts for the time made for the film. Its structure just doesn't appeal to the audience as much as the original did, being partially based upon the wonder of being in Wonderland trying to do something with the world that people really didn't even care for. And if you watch it, you can see that to some degree, not feeling interested after a certain amount of time. This is where you start to notice that you can only go so far with these types of movies depending on an idea, where although the original works might have a basis of something interesting in the film, you also have to consider where that modern basis for the audience is, and the appeal of nostalgia and the reception that actually follows. Because if you just continue it on and do something that people don't really come for, how are you going to get everyone interested in seeing it? The factor to this failing is because the charm of the first wore off. Everyone already knew what to expect from the Wonderland world and they're just returning to it, where the only interesting thing about it was the wacky visuals, as I just said. The narrative structure of these films are another issue that people just can't seem to be interested in continuing to watch. which unfortunately still didn't stop them because at least the other remakes still made tons of cash during the time, and they still greenlit plenty of more sequels in the making, like Maleficent was in the reimagined Sleeping Beauty villain film. And this is something I've already talked about before when I made a video on that particular film and character that had that sequel way back in 2019. The third sequel film in this genre, and the last we will actually take a look at since Mufasa is still fresh out of the oven as of this recording. The title of this film referred to what Maleficent called herself as the pinnacle Disney villain, the Mistress of Evil, but she's hardly anything but trying to remove the stink from the film's villain played by Michelle Pfeiffer before Aurora gets married to Philip. The film involves so many other elements from that makes it more confusing besides its main plot, with more about the origins of Maleficent's species being themselves on display here with their descendants of the Dark Fae race that comes from the Phoenix. You know, that kind of Phoenix, which she is apparently one of the descendants. At times, this film is also visually confusing, with its predominant daylight features that contrast with the darker tone of the original, and then making a big mess of its own tone where Maleficent is and where Aurora wants to be, with one major plot being focused on the fairies being threatened because of this queen who hates their kind when their kingdom suffered at the time and her brother died, combined with this B plot of the Dark Fae who were driven to almost extinction, battling with humans and wanting Maleficent to help them to either achieve peace or war for their kind, joining in at the battle to save Aurora and turning into the Phoenix when they stop Ingrid finally and Phillips forges the peace between all species and they get married and everyone lives happily ever after in the places that they live. Once again, you just have this film that suffers from its original ambition, putting in too much of an epic story for something that was just so simple in the first place, making the villain the hero and attempting to continue that path but branching that path out with its own expansive lore. It's not bad to have these ideas because they are better than just remakes themselves, but you gotta know what kind of film you're telling before people just simply turn it off and watch something else. That's the problem this film faces, since the original one worked because it still focused on Maleficent and her story that, you know, justifies why she was in that sort of way, even though she's not a villain anymore. But the positive thing about this, despite again making less than its original counterpart, is that it achieved the estimated break-even range, but sadly falling short of making an actual profit, where it just continued to prove the same old story told in the simple two other films, that most people just really don't care about these types of sequels. Not to say that people are completely shutting them out, because there's still an audience who wants to see them by the box office performance, but not to the explosive height of why people watch remakes in the first place, those billion-dollar successes that keep the money machine going. That there needs to be a cohesive plan, one that simply doesn't put too much information and tells a good story along the way. The great problem that all of these films fail to have. It sends you mixed messages where they know you want it to be big, but also small, focusing on your connection to some characters or not, in the sake of finding what exactly you want to do with this property after a happy ending, since they are theatrical and not home video releases where you can make a simple feel-good story that doesn't have such important stakes. It just comes out of the result of ambition, wanting to be big because they know their audience expects something of that, being based upon the popular films of the past, but also failing to understand that that big ambition is not why these people even came here in the first place. And what will happen next is yet to be seen, with both Maleficent and potentially the Dalmatians getting another sequel in the works to add to their list despite their own failures financially. Doubtful if it would even remotely improve, and rather just get worse with what has yet to come out, with Mufasa either being a decent profit but clearly not to the height that The Lion King reached previously. All of these films are just ones that will not be remembered greatly, either during its initial release or long after they had just been in their own legacy, and are just simply the product of wanting more of the same and only appearing slightly different. As of now, it still remains to be a small, insignificant portion of their live-action genre, and will still only marginally be able to grow if they cannot find their first heavy hitter, compared to the likes of their own animated counterparts, where despite also not succeeding off their originals, more people will be interested for the sake of where they actually came from in their intended form. And this has been a brief overview of the live-action sequels. May they continue to suffer before they realize how their ideas can truly prosper. And I'm all done. Goodbye.